It was just another busy morning at the Daily Grind, one of Boston's most popular upscale coffee shops, nestled in the heart of the financial district. The warm aroma of freshly ground coffee beans filled the air as suited professionals rushed in and out, clutching their phones and briefcases. Behind the counter, Alex worked diligently, his name tag gleaming under the shop's artistic lighting. At 23, he balanced his time between medical school and this part-time job, which helped cover his textbook expenses and contributed to Vismont's household. The morning rush was in full swing when she walked in. Mrs. Richardson carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from years of getting exactly what she wanted. Her designer handbag probably cost more than what Alex made in 2 months, and her perfectly manicured nails tapped impatiently on her phone screen as she approached the counter. The line parted slightly, several regular customers instinctively stepping aside, already familiar with her reputation for preferential treatment. "Good morning, welcome to the Daily Grind," Alex greeted with his usual warm smile, the same one that had earned him Employee of the Month 3 times running. He genuinely enjoyed making people's days better, even if it was just through a perfectly crafted cup of coffee. Mrs. Richardson barely looked up from her phone. "I need a venti iced sugar-free vanilla latte with almond milk, 3 shots of espresso, light ice, extra foam, and make sure it's exactly 140 degrees. She spoke rapidly, her tone making it clear she had no time for pleasantries. Of course, Alex responded professionally, typing the order into the system. "That'll be $7.85, please." "What?" She finally looked up, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows furrowing. "It was $7.50 yesterday." "I apologize, but there was a small price adjustment this morning. It's company-wide," Alex explained gently, maintaining his composure. He'd already had to explain this to several customers, but most had been understanding. Mrs. Richardson's expression darkened. "That's ridiculous. I come here every day and spend thousands of dollars a year. I'm not paying extra for the same drink." "I understand your frustration," Alex said, keeping his voice steady and professional. "Unfortunately, the pricing is set by corporate, and I don't have the authority to change it. Would you like to proceed with the order?" The coffee shop had grown quieter, other customers and baristas trying not to stare while clearly listening to every word. Mrs. Richardson's voice rose, drawing even more attention. "Do you know who I am? I'm an executive at Boston Memorial Hospital. I don't have time for this nonsense." Alex remained calm, though his heart was beating faster. He'd dealt with difficult customers before, but something in her tone made him uneasy. "I apologize, ma'am, but the price is the same for everyone. Would you like to speak with my manager?" That's when it happened. Mrs. Richardson's face contorted with rage. "You people always think you can tell me what to do." In one swift motion, she grabbed a nearby customer's drink from the pickup counter and threw it directly in Alex's face. The icy liquid dripped down his face, soaking his shirt and apron. The coffee shop fell silent. Phones came out, recording the scene. Alex stood there, cold coffee dripping from his chin, his white shirt now stained brown. He didn't move, didn't retaliate, didn't even speak. Years of his mother's advice echoed in his head. In moments of injustice, your dignity is your strongest weapon. "I'll have your job for this," Mrs. Richardson spat out, gathering her things. "You clearly don't know how to treat important customers." She stormed toward the door, her heels clicking aggressively against the floor. As she reached for the handle, another customer stepped forward. "I have the whole thing on video," the woman announced loudly, "including what you just said about you people." Several others nodded, holding up their phones. Mrs. Richardson faltered for just a moment before pushing through the door, leaving behind a wake of shocked silence and running cameras. Alex's coworker, Raj, rushed over with a clean towel. "You okay, man? That was totally messed up." "I'm fine," Alex said quietly, accepting the towel. His hands trembled slightly as he wiped his face, but his voice remained steady. "Let's get this cleaned up. We still have customers waiting." The store manager, Mr. Chen, emerged from the back office, having witnessed everything on the security cameras. "Alex, take a break. Get cleaned up." "I'm calling corporate right now." He turned to the waiting customers. "I apologize for the disruption, everyone. Your drinks today are on the house." As Alex headed to the back room to change into his spare shirt, customers called out words of support. "We'll make sure everyone sees what happened. You handled that with real class. Don't let her get away with this." In the break room, Alex finally allowed himself a moment alone. His shirt was ruined, and he could still feel the sticky residue of coffee in his hair. But it wasn't the physical discomfort that bothered him most. It was the humiliation, the helplessness, the familiar sting of being judged before being known. He pulled out his phone, seeing several missed calls from classmates. The incident was probably already spreading across social media. His thumb hovering over his mom's contact, he hesitated. She had enough on her plate, running her department at the hospital. Besides, what could she do? Little did he know, his mother's position would soon turn this incident into something much bigger than a viral video. But for now, Alex did what he'd always done. He changed his shirt, squared his shoulders, and walked back out to finish his shift. He had customers waiting, and medical school textbooks wouldn't pay for themselves. As he stepped back behind the counter, Alex noticed something had shifted. The regular customers were watching him with a mix of respect and concern. Mr. Chen was still on the phone with corporate, gesturing animatively. And outside, through the large windows, he could see people stopping to watch the videos their friends were showing them, pointing at the coffee shop with looks of disbelief. The morning rush continued, but now every customer seemed extra kind, leaving larger tips and offering words of encouragement. Alex appreciated their support, but part of him wished everything could just go back to normal. He hadn't asked to become the center of attention or the subject of viral videos. He just wanted to do his job, earn his wages, and continue working toward his dream of becoming a doctor. What Alex didn't realize was that by tomorrow morning, his simple interaction with an entitled customer would explode into something much bigger. The video would reach certain eyes at Boston Memorial Hospital, and Mrs. Richardson would learn a valuable lesson about judging people based on their current occupation or appearance. But that was tomorrow's story. For now, Alex focused on making perfect lattes, sharing genuine smiles, and showing everyone that one person's cruelty couldn't dim his light. The rest of Alex's shift passed in a blur of sympathetic glances and hushed conversations. By closing time, his phone was buzzing constantly with notifications. The video had already spread across several social media platforms, with thousands of shares and comments expressing outrage at Mrs. Richardson's behavior. Walking home in the evening darkness, Alex felt the weight of the day on his shoulders. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and approaching winter. He watched his breath form small clouds in front of him, trying to clear his mind. The same route he'd walked hundreds of times before somehow felt different tonight. His small apartment building came into view, its worn brick facade somehow more welcoming than usual. The third-floor windows glowed warmly. His mom was home early for once. Dr. Bennett usually worked late at the hospital, her position as chief of surgery keeping her busy with endless meetings and responsibilities. Tonight, though, she'd managed to make it home before him. As Alex climbed the stairs, he could smell something cooking. His mom's stress relief activity had always been cooking, and by the rich aroma wafting through the hallway, today had been particularly stressful. He paused outside their door, taking a deep breath. Should he tell her about what happened? She had enough on her plate already, dealing with hospital politics and managing an entire surgical department. The key turned in the lock, and he stepped inside to find his mom in their small kitchen, stirring something that smelled like her famous chicken soup. She looked up with a smile that quickly turned to concern. Despite his best efforts to clean up, some coffee stains were still visible on his collar. "Rough day?" she asked, her expert eyes taking in details most people would miss. Years of assessing patients had given her an almost supernatural ability to spot when something was wrong. Just the usual coffee shop drama. Alex tried to sound casual, dropping his bag by the door. "Something smells amazing." His mom raised an eyebrow, the same expression she used when interns tried to gloss over their mistakes during rounds. "The usual doesn't usually leave stains on your shirt." She turned down the heat under the pot and wiped her hands on a kitchen towel. "Want to talk about it?" Alex sank into one of their mismatched kitchen chairs, suddenly exhausted. "It's not a big deal, Mom. Just had a difficult customer today." He pulled out his phone, seeing dozens more notifications. Though it might become one. Someone recorded it and put it online. Dr. Bennett sat down across from him, her face serious. Tell me everything. So he did. He described Mrs. Richardson's behavior, the coffee-throwing incident, and how he'd handled it. His mom listened quietly, her expression growing increasingly concerned. When he finished, she reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I'm so proud of how you handled that," she said softly. "But this isn't okay, Alex. This kind of behavior can't be ignored." "I know, Mom. Mr. Chen already reported it to corporate, and the video's going viral. She'll probably face some consequences from that alone." Alex stood up, heading to his room to change. "I just want to focus on my studies and not let this become a bigger thing than it needs to be." In his room, Alex changed out of his stained work clothes and sat at his desk, trying to focus on his medical textbooks. Tomorrow's anatomy exam wouldn't study for itself, but the words blurred in front of him as the day's events kept replaying in his mind. His phone buzzed again, a message from Raj. "Dude, you're trending. #CoffeeKaren is everywhere." Attached was a link to a news website that had picked up the story. Alex clicked it, then immediately wished he hadn't. The comments section was a battlefield of opinions, with some people defending Mrs. Richardson's right to express frustration with poor service, while others called for her to be identified and fired. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. His mom stood there with 2 bowls of soup and a determined look on her face. "Dinner in your room tonight. You need to eat, and we need to talk." They sat on his bed like they used to when he was younger, backs against the wall, bowls balanced carefully on their laps. The familiar comfort of his mom's cooking helped ease some of the day's tension. "You know," his mom started, stirring her soup thoughtfully, "when I first started as an intern, there was an attending physician who used to treat me like I was invisible. He'd talk over me during rounds, dismiss my observations, even make comments about how certain people didn't belong in surgery." She paused, letting the words sink in. "One day, he found out I was being considered for chief resident. His attitude changed immediately, but I never forgot how he treated me when he thought I was nobody." Alex looked at his mom, really looked at her. She rarely talked about her early days in medicine, about the barriers she'd faced and broken through. What happened to him? A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Last I heard, he was passed over for department head at Boston Memorial. The board wasn't impressed with his history of discriminatory behavior." She set her empty bowl aside. "The point is, people like Mrs. Richardson and that attending physician exist everywhere. They judge others based on their current position, never considering that the person serving their coffee might be a future surgeon, or that the intern they're dismissing might one day be their boss." Alex nodded slowly, understanding what his mom wasn't directly saying. "I get it, Mom, but I don't want special treatment or revenge. I just want to finish medical school and become a good doctor like you." "Sometimes standing up against discrimination isn't about revenge or special treatment," she replied, standing up and collecting their bowls. "It's about making sure the next person doesn't have to go through the same thing." She paused at the door. "Get some sleep, honey. Tomorrow might be a busy day." After she left, Alex tried to return to his studying, but his mind kept wandering to his mom's words. He checked his phone one last time before bed. The video had now been viewed over 1 million times. Tomorrow would indeed be interesting. What Alex didn't know was that in another part of Boston, Mrs. Richardson was also having a restless night, completely unaware that her actions had caught the attention of someone who could significantly impact her career. The woman she humiliated wasn't just any coffee shop worker, he was the son of one of the most influential medical professionals in Boston. As Alex finally drifted off to sleep, his anatomy textbook still open on his desk, the wheels of justice were already in motion. Sometimes, karma doesn't take long to come full circle, and Mrs. Richardson was about to learn a valuable lesson about judging people based on appearances. The next morning dawned bright and cold at Boston Memorial Hospital. Dr. Bennett sat in her office, reviewing surgical schedules for the week ahead. The early morning light streamed through the large windows, highlighting the degrees and awards that lined her walls, testaments to decades of breaking barriers in medicine. She sipped her coffee, made it hum today instead of from the daily grind, when a series of urgent knocks interrupted her morning routine. Her assistant, Mr. Parker, burst in without waiting for a response, something he'd never done in 5 years of working together. "Dr. Bennett, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this." His usually composed demeanor was ruffled, his tablet clutched tightly in his hands. "There's a situation going viral on social media involving one of our executives." She gestured for him to continue, already preparing herself for another hospital PR crisis. In her position, she'd handled everything from leaked patient information to surgical mishaps, but something in Mr. Parker's expression suggested this was different. He placed the tablet in front of her, a video already queued up. "This happened yesterday at the Daily Grind coffee shop. The woman in the video, it's Mrs. Richardson from the board of directors." Dr. Bennett's heart stopped as the video began playing. She recognized the coffee shop immediately. It was where Alex worked. As the scene unfolded on screen, her hands gripped the edge of her desk, knuckles turning white. Watching her son being humiliated, seeing the coffee splash across his face, hearing the hateful words, it took every ounce of her professional composure not to react visibly. "The video has over 2 million views now," Mr. Parker continued, unaware that he was describing an attack on his boss's son. "Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, it's everywhere. People are calling for action from the hospital board." Dr. Bennett stood slowly, her chair rolling back against the wall. She walked to the window, using the moment to collect herself. Below, doctors, nurses, and patients streamed in and out of the hospital entrance, none aware of the storm brewing above. "Have you seen the comments?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Yes, ma'am. People have identified Mrs. Richardson as a hospital executive. They're demanding accountability. Several civil rights organizations have already released statements." She turned back to face him. "Call an emergency board meeting, 9 a.m. sharp. Everyone must attend." Her tone left no room for discussion. "And Mr. Parker, don't tell anyone I've seen this video yet." As her assistant hurried out, Dr. Bennett sank back into her chair. She pulled out her phone, seeing several missed calls from Alex. Her son, always trying to protect her from worry, hadn't said anything during dinner last night about the video going viral. She hit play again, watching the scene unfold once more. 20 minutes later, her office phone lit up. Mrs. Richardson herself was calling. Dr. Bennett watched it ring, remembering all the times this woman had swept past residents and nurses like they were invisible, how she'd spoken condescendingly to staff of color during hospital functions. The phone kept ringing, but Dr. Bennett let it go to voicemail. Some lessons were best learned in public. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of phone calls and emails. Every news outlet in Boston wanted a statement. Social media was ablaze with hashtags demanding action. Hospital donors were expressing concern. Through it all, Dr. Bennett maintained her composure, methodically preparing for the board meeting that would change several lives. At 8:55 a.m., she stood in the empty boardroom, arranging papers at her seat at the head of the table. One by one, board members filed in, their faces grim. Mrs. Richardson arrived last, her usual confidence notably dimmed. She'd clearly seen the video's impact on social media, but she held her head high, probably counting on her connections to weather the storm. The room fell silent as Dr. Bennett remained standing. Her presence had always commanded respect, but today there was something different in her bearing. She picked up a remote and turned on the large screen behind her. "Before we begin," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I'd like us all to watch something together." The video began playing, larger than life on the screen. Mrs. Richardson shifted uncomfortably in her seat, seeing herself from this new angle, hearing her own words echo in the quiet room. When it ended, Dr. Bennett didn't speak immediately. She let the silence stretch, heavy with unspoken judgment. Finally, she turned to face the board, her eyes finding Mrs. Richardson's. "The young man in this video," she said, each word carefully measured, "is my son." The sharp intake of breath from around the table was audible. Mrs. Richardson's face drained of color as the full implications hit her. The student she humiliated, the coffee shop worker she deemed beneath her notice, was the son of not just any doctor, but Dr. Bennett, chief of surgery, board member, and one of the most respected medical professionals in Boston. "He works part-time to help pay for medical school," Dr. Bennett continued, her voice never rising but carrying unmistakable steel. "In a few years, he'll be a resident in a hospital just like this one. Yesterday, he learned how some healthcare executives treat people they consider beneath them. Today, we're going to make sure that lesson doesn't go to waste." The boardroom remained silent, every person present understanding that they were witnessing a pivotal moment. Mrs. Richardson stared at her folded hands, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. She had walked into this room thinking her biggest problem was a viral video. Now she realized she had done something far worse. She had revealed her true character to exactly the wrong people. Dr. Bennett took her seat, smoothly transitioning into her role as meeting chair. Now, shall we discuss how Boston Memorial Hospital plans to address this situation? She opened her folder, the sound of papers rustling unnaturally loud in the tense room. I believe we have some decisions to make about our commitment to diversity, equity, and basic human dignity. The morning sun continued to stream through the boardroom windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Outside, the hospital continued its daily rhythm of saving lives. But in that room, another kind of healing was about to begin, the kind that starts with accountability and ends with change. Mrs. Richardson's morning had started with a pounding headache and a sense of dread. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since yesterday, filled with messages from concerned colleagues and angry strangers who had somehow found her social media accounts. She'd switched it to silent mode, trying to convince herself this would all blow over soon. Her driver dropped her off at Boston Memorial's main entrance, where she'd walked confidently through those doors hundreds of times before. Today felt different. The security guard who usually greeted her with a cheerful "good morning" kept his eyes firmly fixed on his monitor. The nurses who typically scattered from her path now watched her pass with poorly concealed interest. The elevator ride to the executive floor was excruciating. A young resident stepped in, then immediately stepped back out after recognizing her. By the time she reached her office, Mrs. Richardson's hands were shaking as she unlocked the door. She had barely settled at her desk when her assistant knocked. "The board meeting has been moved up. 9 a.m. sharp in the main conference room," her assistant said flatly, without making eye contact. Dr. Bennett's office was very clear about attendance being mandatory. Mrs. Richardson's stomach churned at the mention of Dr. Bennett's name. They'd served on committees together, attended the same charity galas, moved in the same social circles. Surely the chief of surgery would understand how stressful yesterday had been, how that coffee shop worker had provoked her with his attitude about the price increase. She spent the next hour rehearsing explanations in her head while answering urgent emails from hospital donors expressing their concerns about the viral video. Each message grew increasingly difficult to respond to as more news outlets picked up the story. At 8:55 a.m., Mrs. Richardson smoothed her designer skirt and made her way to the boardroom. The usual pre-meeting chatter died as she entered. Faces that normally smiled in greeting now turned away. She took her usual seat, noticing how others subtly shifted their chairs away from hers. The room fell silent as Dr. Bennett stood at the head of the table. Mrs. Richardson had always admired how the chief of surgery commanded respect without raising her voice. Today, that same quiet authority felt threatening. When the video started playing on the screen, Mrs. Richardson wanted to disappear into her chair. Her own voice, sharp with entitlement, filled the room. The sound of liquid splashing, the gasps of onlookers, the hateful words she'd spat in anger, it all seemed so much worse in this professional setting, surrounded by her peers. But nothing could have prepared her for what came next. "The young man in this video is my son." Dr. Bennett's words hit like a physical blow. Mrs. Richardson's world tilted sideways as memories flooded back. All the times she'd mentioned her son in meetings, how proud she was of his acceptance to medical school, his dedication to working while studying. That young man behind the counter, the one she'd treated like dirt, was the same person Dr. Bennett had spoken about with such pride. The realization made her physically ill. She'd thrown coffee in the face of the chief of surgery's son. She'd hurled insults at a future doctor, someone who would one day be treating patients in this very hospital. Worse, she'd revealed her true character to the entire board, and to Dr. Bennett, whose influence in the medical community was legendary. I didn't know," Mrs. Richardson stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "That's precisely the point," Dr. Bennett replied, her calm tone somehow more devastating than anger would have been. "You didn't know who he was, so you felt entitled to treat him as less than human. Would knowing his connection to me have changed your behavior? Should it have to?" The questions hung in the air, unanswerable. Around the table, Other board members shifted uncomfortably, perhaps remembering their own moments of casual cruelty to service workers. Mrs. Richardson, one of the senior board members, spoke up. "This video has been viewed by millions. We're receiving calls from major news networks, civil rights organizations, and hospital partners. Our donors are threatening to withdraw support. The public is demanding action." She nodded numbly, her carefully constructed professional image crumbling around her. The designer clothes, the expensive handbag, the executive title, none of it could shield her from the consequences of her actions. "I apologize," she said, looking directly at Dr. Bennett. "I was having a bad day and I took it out on your son. It was unprofessional and wrong." An apology given only after discovering the identity of the person you've wronged carries little weight, Dr. Bennett responded. She opened a folder in front of her. "Now let's discuss the hospital's response to this incident." For the next hour, Mrs. Richardson sat silently as the board debated her future. They discussed media statements, diversity training programs, and policy changes. Her career, her reputation, everything she'd worked for hung in the balance. She thought about her own children, wondering how they would feel seeing their mother's behavior plastered across social media. As the meeting drew to a close, Dr. Bennett made one final statement that would echo in Mrs. Richardson's mind for months to come. "The true measure of a person isn't how they treat those they think are important, but how they treat those they think aren't looking." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Someone is always looking, Mrs. Richardson, and today, the whole world is watching how we respond." Walking back to her office afterward, Mrs. Richardson noticed every face that turned away from her, every whispered conversation that stopped as she passed. The hospital corridors felt endless, each step bringing a new realization of just how far she had fallen. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket. Another news outlet requesting comment. But for the first time in her career, Mrs. Richardson had nothing to say. After the board meeting, Dr. Bennett asked Mrs. Richardson to meet her in her office. The walk down the hospital corridor felt like the longest of Mrs. Richardson's life. Every squeak of her expensive heels on the polished floor reminded her of how quickly her world was unraveling. Dr. Bennett's office was exactly what you'd expect from one of Boston's top surgeons, neat, organized, and filled with achievements. Medical journals lined the bookshelves, and through the large windows, the city sprawled out below them. But what caught Mrs. Richardson's eye was a small framed photo on the desk. Alex in his white coat at his medical school white coat ceremony, beaming proudly next to his mother. "Please, sit," Dr. Bennett gestured to the chair across from her desk. Her voice was professional, but there was an edge to it that made Mrs. Richardson's stomach tighten. "We need to have a conversation about yesterday's events, and more importantly, about their implications for your future at this hospital." Mrs. Richardson sank into the chair, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. "Dr. Bennett, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am. If I had known." "That's exactly the problem." Dr. Bennett cut her off, her calm voice carrying more weight than any shout could. "You're sorry because he turned out to be my son. Would you be sitting here apologizing if he was just another coffee shop worker?" The question hung in the air between them. Through the office walls, they could hear the routine sounds of the hospital, pages over the intercom, the distant ding of elevators, the controlled chaos of saving lives. "I had a terrible morning," Mrs. Richardson tried to explain. The price increase, the attitude. "Let's talk about terrible mornings," Dr. Bennett interrupted again, opening a folder on her desk. "Last month, my son worked a double shift at that coffee shop because his coworker's child was sick. He then went straight to an 8-hour anatomy lab. The week before that, he stayed up all night studying for exams, but still showed up at 5 a.m. to open the shop. He's never once thrown coffee at anyone." Mrs. Richardson felt tears welling up in her eyes. Not the elegant, camera-ready tears she'd planned to use in her public apology, but real, messy tears of shame. "My son," Dr. Bennett continued, her voice softening slightly, "works that job to help pay for his textbooks. He doesn't need to. I could cover his expenses. But he wants to earn his own way, to understand what it means to serve others before he becomes a doctor." She picked up the photo from her desk. "Yesterday, you didn't just throw coffee at a server. You threw it at everything he represents: hard work, humility, dedication to service." The hospital intercom crackled with another announcement, but neither woman paid attention to it. Mrs. Richardson found herself looking at her own reflection in the window, designer clothes, perfect makeup, carefully maintained appearance. For the first time, she wondered what others saw when they looked at her. "The board has given me discretion in handling this situation," Dr. Bennett said, returning the photo to its place. "I could recommend immediate termination. The PR department already has a statement prepared, distancing the hospital from your actions. It would be the easy solution." Mrs. Richardson's heart raced. Her career, her reputation, her social standing, everything hung on Dr. Bennett's next words. However, Dr. Bennett continued, "I believe in teaching moments, even difficult ones." She pulled out another folder. "I have a different proposal." Over the next 30 minutes, Dr. Bennett outlined a comprehensive plan. Mrs. Richardson would take a 3-month leave of absence, during which she would complete an intensive diversity and sensitivity training program. But that wasn't all. "You'll volunteer 3 days a week at our community health clinics," Dr. Bennett explained. "Not in administration, you'll work directly with patients from all walks of life. You'll see firsthand how many of them work multiple jobs, just like my son, to make ends meet while pursuing their dreams." Mrs. Richardson nodded slowly, relief mixing with apprehension. "And after the 3 months?" "That depends entirely on you," Dr. Bennett replied. "Your position will be reviewed based on demonstrated growth and changed behavior. This isn't about punishment, it's about transformation." A knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Bennett's assistant poked his head in. "Sorry to interrupt, but you're needed in surgery, Dr. Bennett." She nodded, standing. "Think about what I've said, Mrs. Richardson. This isn't just about saving your job. It's about becoming someone who deserves to work in a profession dedicated to helping others." As Mrs. Richardson stood to leave, her legs shaky, Dr. Bennett added one final thought. "Oh, and you'll need to make a public apology. Not to me, not to the hospital board, but to my son, and to every service worker who's ever been treated as less than human by someone who thought their job defined their worth." Walking out of the office, Mrs. Richardson felt strangely lighter, despite the weight of everything that had happened. The hospital corridors looked different now. She noticed the maintenance worker carefully mopping the floor, the cafeteria staff restocking vending machines, the volunteers guiding lost visitors. All these people she'd previously looked through rather than at. Her phone buzzed with another news alert about the viral video, but for once, she didn't feel the urge to check it. Instead, she watched a young medical student rush past, coffee cup in hand, looking just as determined as Alex had behind that counter. She had a lot of work to do, and for the first time in her career, none of it had anything to do with her title or status. Back in her office, Dr. Bennett picked up her phone to call Alex. Her son needed to know what had happened, and more importantly, he needed to know that his mother had found a way to turn an act of cruelty into an opportunity for real change. Sometimes, she thought, the best surgical procedures weren't performed in an operating room, but in the human heart. 3 weeks into her rehabilitation program, Mrs. Richardson found herself in a place she never expected to be, the waiting room of Hope Community Health Clinic at 7 a.m., wearing plain scrubs instead of her usual designer suits. The small clinic, located in one of Boston's working-class neighborhoods, served people who couldn't afford traditional hospital care. "Morning, Mrs. R," called out Miss Betty, the elderly receptionist who'd taken her under her wing. "Ready for another busy day?" The simple greeting warmed her heart. When she'd first arrived, the staff had been understandably cold. They'd all seen the viral video. But over time, as they watched her genuinely trying to learn and help, their attitudes had slowly changed. "The morning rush will start soon," Miss Betty continued, handing her a stack of intake forms. "Lot of people coming in before their work shifts today." As if on cue, the door opened, letting in a blast of cold morning air and a young woman in a coffee shop uniform, clutching a toddler who was clearly running a fever. Mrs. Richardson felt a familiar twist in her stomach. Just weeks ago, she would have barely noticed the woman's existence. "Hi, I'm Rita," she said softly, approaching them. "My son's been sick all night, but I have to get to my shift at Bean's Coffee in an hour." The woman's voice cracked with exhaustion. Mrs. Richardson glanced at the barely touched coffee shop uniform, remembering her own actions that had started all of this. "Let me help you with the paperwork," she offered, pulling up a chair. We'll make sure your son sees the doctor first so you can get to work." As she helped Rita fill out forms, Mrs. Richardson learned that she was taking online classes while working 2 jobs to support her son. "It's tough," Rita admitted, "but I'm going to be a nurse someday. My customers at the coffee shop probably think I'm just a barista, but I'm studying medical terminology during my breaks." The words hit home. How many dreams had she dismissed behind those coffee shop counters? How many future doctors, nurses, and professionals has she looked right through? Throughout the morning, more patients arrived. A construction worker with an injured hand who couldn't afford to miss his shift, an elderly man who took 3 buses to get to the clinic, a teenage girl accompanying her non-English speaking grandmother. Mrs. Richardson found herself fully immersed in their stories, no longer seeing them as interruptions to her day, but as people with lives just as complex and worthy as her own. During her lunch break, she sat in the small staff room, reflecting on how much had changed. Her designer handbag had been replaced by a practical backpack, her perfectly manicured nails were now kept short and clean for patient care, and somehow she felt more fulfilled than she had in years. Dr. Chen, the clinic's head physician, joined her with his own lunch. "You're doing good work here," he said simply. "The patients have noticed. So has the staff." "I never knew," she admitted, picking at her sandwich. "All these years in healthcare administration, I thought I understood our patients. But I was so removed from their real lives, their daily struggles." "That's why Dr. Bennett sent you here," he smiled. "She knew you needed to see healthcare from the other side of the desk." The afternoon brought more lessons. She helped an elderly woman understand her medication schedule, translated complex medical terms into simple language for a worried parent, and held the hand of a scared teenager getting her first blood test. Each interaction taught her something new about humanity and humility. Near closing time, a familiar face walked in. Alex, Dr. Bennett's son, still in his coffee shop uniform. Her heart skipped a beat, but he smiled warmly. "Mom told me I might find you here," he said, setting down a cup of coffee on the front desk. "Thought you might need this after a long day." Mrs. Richardson stared at the cup, remembering how differently she handled coffee just weeks ago. "I don't deserve this kindness," she said quietly. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he replied. "Besides, I've heard about the work you're doing here. Real change isn't about grand gestures, it's about showing up every day and choosing to be better." They talked for a while about his medical school experiences, her work at the clinic, and the surprising parallels between serving coffee and serving patients. Both required patience, empathy, and the ability to see the person behind the transaction. As she prepared to leave that evening, Mrs. Richardson looked around the small clinic that had become her classroom in humanity. The vinyl chairs, the slightly worn linoleum floors, the faded posters about health education, everything she once would have considered beneath her now represented something profound about service and dignity. Miss Betty caught her eye as she gathered her things. "You're not the same person who walked in here 3 weeks ago," she observed. "No," Mrs. Richardson agreed. "I'm not. And I don't want to be that person again." On her bus ride home, another new experience she'd learned to appreciate, she pulled out her journal, part of her rehabilitation program. Today's entry would be different from her early ones filled with complaints about the long hours and humble conditions. Today, she wrote about Rita and her dreams of becoming a nurse, about Alex's gesture of forgiveness, about the countless moments of human connection she'd experienced. Her phone buzzed with an email from Dr. Bennett, requesting an update on her progress. For the first time, Mrs. Richardson felt genuinely excited to share what she'd learned, not about hospital administration or healthcare policies, but about the simple yet profound truth that every person, regardless of their job or circumstances, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. As she wrote her response, she realized that what had started as a punishment had become something entirely different. A journey of transformation that no designer handbag or executive title could have given her. The real wealth, she was learning, lay in the connections we make when we choose to see people for who they really are. 6 months had passed since the coffee shop incident, and Boston Memorial Hospital's main conference room was packed for the monthly staff meeting. Mrs. Richardson stood at the podium, looking very different from the woman who had once stormed out of a coffee shop in designer heels. "When I first started the community service program," she began, addressing the room full of medical staff, I thought it was a punishment. Today, I'm here to tell you it was the greatest gift I've ever received." Her voice carried genuine emotion that made even the skeptics in the room lean forward. The presentation screen behind her showed photos from the Hope Community Health Clinic, images of her working alongside nurses, helping patients, and learning from the community she once ignored. Her perfectly tailored suits had given way to practical business wear, and the harsh edge in her voice had been replaced by something warmer. "Last week, a young woman came into the clinic," Mrs. Richardson continued. "She was wearing a fast food uniform and apologized for coming in during her lunch break. She reminded me of myself 6 months ago, but not in a way you might think. Like me, she had a dream. Unlike me, she never lost sight of what really matters." In the front row, Dr. Bennett watched with quiet satisfaction. Next to her sat Alex, now in his clinical rotations at the hospital, his white coat crisp and professional. They exchanged a knowing look as Mrs. Richardson shared story after story of the lives she'd encountered and the lessons she'd learned. "The true measure of a healthcare system isn't in its fancy equipment or prestigious titles," she said, her voice strong with conviction. "It's in how we treat every single person who walks through our doors, whether they're a CEO or a cleaning staff member, a surgeon or a student working part-time to pay for books." The room fell silent as she clicked to the next slide, a photo of the coffee shop where everything had changed. "This is where I had my wake-up call. I threw coffee at a young man because I thought his job made him less worthy of respect than me. That young man is now doing his clinical rotations in this very hospital, proving that you can never judge someone's journey by a single moment in their life." Alex smiled slightly, remembering how that morning had felt like the worst day of his job. Now, somehow, it had become a catalyst for real change in the hospital's culture. Mrs. Richardson turned to the next part of her presentation, the new hospital initiatives she'd helped develop during her rehabilitation. "We're implementing mandatory sensitivity training for all staff members, from the board of directors to the newest volunteers. But more importantly, we're creating bridges between our main hospital and community clinics." She outlined programs that would rotate administrative staff through community service, ensuring that everyone understood the real lives of the patients they served. The initiative had already been praised by healthcare networks across the country. "But the most significant change," she continued, her voice softening, "has been in here." She touched her heart. "I learned that true leadership isn't about power or position, it's about service. Every person who works in healthcare, from the surgeon performing a life-saving operation to the barista serving coffee to tired residents, is part of the same mission, helping others." As she concluded her presentation, the applause wasn't just polite, it was genuine. The hospital staff had watched her transformation over the past 6 months, had seen her working weekends at the clinic long after her mandatory service was complete, had noticed how she now knew every cleaning staff member by name. After the meeting, Dr. Bennett approached her. "That was quite a presentation," she said with a warm smile. "How are you feeling?" Mrs. Richardson took a deep breath. "Grateful," she replied honestly. "You could have fired me that day. Instead, you showed me a better way." "Sometimes the hardest lessons are the most important ones." Dr. Bennett nodded. "Are you ready for your new role?" The board had just approved Mrs. Richardson's appointment as Director of Community Health Initiatives, a position she would never have wanted 6 months ago. Now, it felt like exactly where she belonged. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Richardson walked into the Daily Grind. The same coffee shop that had witnessed her worst moment now saw a very different person. She waited patiently in line, chatting with other customers, learning their names and stories. When she reached the counter, the new barista looked nervous, her hands shaking slightly as she took the order. Mrs. Richardson smiled kindly. "Take your time," she said softly. "We all have to start somewhere." As she waited for her drink, she noticed a young woman in scrubs studying medical textbooks in the corner. 6 months ago, she wouldn't have seen her at all. Now, she walked over and asked if she could share her story. Outside, the Boston afternoon buzzed with activity. Inside, 2 women, one at the beginning of her journey, one well into a new chapter of hers, talked about dreams, determination, and the unexpected ways life teaches us its most important lessons. Mrs. Richardson's phone buzzed with messages about upcoming community health projects, but for now, she just listened to the aspiring doctor's story, remembering how a single moment of cruelty had led to countless acts of kindness. Sometimes, she realized, our worst mistakes can lead us to our best selves if we're brave enough to learn and humble enough to change.